Hey there. Welcome to Midnight Sleep Crime. I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep. So, before you get cozy, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'd love to hear from you. Story 1. The cul-de-sac on Willowbrook Lane had always been a place of calm predictability. Rows of identical homes lined the quiet street, each with neatly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and porches where families sat during summer evenings sipping lemonade. Neighbors knew one another by name, their children played together on the sidewalks, their dogs barked at the mailman in unison. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, untouched by the chaos of the wider world. At least, until the house with the red door changed everything. For years, number 58 had stood vacant. It was a two-story colonial, its once white siding now weathered into a sickly shade of gray. The shutters hung crookedly, and vines crawled up the walls like nature trying to reclaim what had been abandoned. Kids in the neighborhood dared each other to sneak up to the porch at night, knock on the red front door, and run before the ghosts answered. It was the kind of house that sparked whispered rumors, but nothing more. Until, one spring evening, moving trucks appeared, and a family quietly moved in. The father was the first one neighbors noticed. A tall man with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl etched into his face. He carried boxes with ease, his movements stiff, almost mechanical. He didn't wave when people drove by. He didn't look around as though curious about his new surroundings. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground or the front door. The mother came next. She was thin, almost fragile-looking, with pale skin and hair that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. She wore long-sleeve dresses despite the warm weather, and she never seemed to smile. She carried smaller boxes, carefully, almost protectively, like they contained something precious or breakable. Then came the boy. A teenager, maybe 15 or 16. He wore his hood up even in daylight, his eyes darting nervously whenever anyone glanced his way. He moved slower than the others, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He seemed uncomfortable, like he didn't want to be there. The family didn't introduce themselves. No welcome plate was put on the porch, no attempt was made to shake hands with the neighbors. They unpacked quickly, quietly, and by sundown, the red door closed with a heavy thud that seemed to echo down the block. From the very beginning, the house felt wrong. On Willowbrook Lane, small things mattered. A new family usually meant homemade pies delivered by the Hendersons at number 54, or Mr. and Mrs. Daly inviting them to the neighborhood barbecue. But when the Dalys knocked on the red door with a casserole dish in hand, nobody answered. They waited, listening for footsteps, the shuffle of movement, anything. But all they heard was silence. Other neighbors tried too. Mrs. Carter sent her 10-year-old daughter with a plate of cookies, but the girl came running back down the driveway, wide-eyed. "Someone was looking at me," she whispered. "From the window." When Mrs. Carter asked which window, her daughter pointed to the upstairs one, just above the red door. But when the mother looked, the curtains swayed slightly, as if it had just been pulled shut. The sense of unease only grew in the following weeks. The family rarely left the house. The father's truck was seen occasionally pulling into the driveway late at night, but no one knew where he went during the day. The mother was spotted once or twice hanging laundry in the backyard, but she never acknowledged the friendly waves from across the fence. The boy went to school but spoke to no one, walking with his head down and eating lunch alone. And then there were the noises. At night, neighbors reported hearing strange sounds coming from number 58. Heavy thuds, dragging noises, and once, what sounded like a muffled scream. Dogs barked furiously at the house, their hackles raised, but when their owners pulled them away, the animals cowered as if afraid. The whispers started soon after. "Something's wrong with them. He doesn't look like the boy wants to live there. I heard they're in some kind of trouble. I saw the father digging in the backyard at 3 in the morning." But no one confronted them directly. Willowbrook Lane was polite. Too polite. One afternoon, Susan Daly, the nosiest neighbor on the block, watched from her kitchen window as the boy came home from school. His hoodie was torn at the sleeve, and he had a bruise blooming across his cheekbone. He paused on the porch, staring at the red door like he was hesitating to go inside. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small key, and unlocked it. He didn't knock, didn't ring the bell, just let himself in, closing it behind him. That was the first time Susan wondered if maybe the boy wasn't as free as he looked. 2 nights later, she heard it again. A noise that made her skin crawl. It came just after midnight, 3 loud bangs, like someone slamming against a wall. Then silence. Then a faint voice, almost like crying. She grabbed her phone and considered calling the police, but something inside her hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if she was just imagining it? But the next morning, she saw the boy again. His bruise was worse, and she swore she saw his lips move as though he were whispering something when he glanced at her across the street. She couldn't hear it, but she thought she knew what it was. Help me. The red door became a symbol. A barrier between the perfect, sunny world of Willowbrook Lane and whatever secrets festered inside number 58. The neighbors started avoiding walking too close to the house. Children crossed to the other side of the street. Halloween came and went, but no decorations appeared on the porch, and no lights were left on for trick-or-treaters. The house stood dark, silent, and unwelcoming. Yet there was life inside. Shadows moved behind curtains. The flicker of a television screen could sometimes be seen through the blinds. Once, a loud crash rattled the walls, followed by the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice crying out. But the next morning, when Mr. Daly casually mentioned it to the father while they both fetched their newspapers, the man just stared at him with cold, unblinking eyes. "You must have been dreaming," the father said flatly. Then he walked inside and shut the red door in his face. By winter, unease had turned into quiet fear. The family was a mystery nobody dared to solve. But the red door kept its secrets well. Until the night of the fire. It was January, bitterly cold, when smoke began to rise from the chimney of number 58. That wasn't unusual. Lots of houses had fireplaces, but this smoke was thick, black, and acrid, carrying a smell that made people wrinkle their noses. It didn't smell like wood. It smelled like chemicals. The fire department was called, and trucks rolled onto Willowbrook Lane, sirens blaring. Firefighters rushed into the house with axes and hoses, prepared for the worst. But when they emerged minutes later, there was no sign of flames. Just a fire in the basement furnace that had gotten out of control. At least, that's what the father told them. But one firefighter swore he saw something else. A row of padlocks on the inside of the basement door. When he mentioned it later, his supervisor told him to let it go. "Not our business," the man said. "We put out fires. We don't start them." And so, the red door stayed closed. The story of the family at number 58 was only just beginning, but already, Willowbrook Lane was no longer the safe haven it had once been. The neighbors who used to gather on porches at dusk now locked their doors early, whispering warnings to their children to stay away from that house. The house with the red door had become something more than just an eyesore. It was a wound on the street, a silent presence that seemed to grow darker with each passing day. And for the boy behind that door, the one who never smiled, the one with bruises and whispered please, the nightmare was only just unfolding. Because secrets like the ones inside number 58 don't stay buried forever. They always have a way of clawing to the surface. Willowbrook Lane had always thrived on gossip, though most of it was harmless. Before the family moved into number 58, whispers revolved around who had the nicest lawn, which couple was secretly fighting, or whether Mrs. Henderson really added vodka to her lemonade during the block parties. But when the house with the red door became occupied, the tone of those whispers shifted. They turned darker, sharper, as if the neighbors themselves sensed the shadow that had fallen across their quiet street. The Dalys were the first to give voice to the unease. Susan Daly couldn't help herself. She was a natural observer. Sitting at her kitchen window with her ever-present cup of coffee, she had the perfect view of number 58's front yard. If anything unusual happened on Willowbrook Lane, Susan was the first to know. "They don't mow their lawn properly," she told her husband one evening, though her voice trembled slightly. "I watched him do it yesterday. He only cut the middle section, left the edges long, like he didn't care what it looked like." "Who does that?" Her husband, Ron, grunted from behind his newspaper. "Maybe he doesn't care about appearances." "That's the problem," Susan whispered. Everyone here cares about appearances. He doesn't. She didn't say what she was really thinking, that it wasn't just the lawn. It was the way the boy had looked at her, bruised and hollow-eyed, the way the curtains twitched when anyone got too close, the way the house seemed alive at night. By February, the whispers had spread. At the Hendersons' Sunday brunch, Mrs. Carter leaned over her plate of pancakes and murmured, "I saw her in the backyard again." The mother. She was hanging laundry, but, she lowered her voice, one of the sheets had what looked like blood on it. "Oh, for heaven's sake," scoffed Mr. Henderson. "It could have been tomato sauce." "Tomato sauce doesn't drip like that," Mrs. Carter said. "I know what I saw." The table fell silent for a moment, until Mrs. Henderson broke it with a nervous laugh. "Well, I'm sure it's nothing. People like them probably just keep to themselves." But the pause lingered. Nobody was sure what people like them even meant. Children, of course, picked up on the tension, even if no one told them directly. They whispered their own versions of the story during games of tag and hopscotch, daring each other to run up the driveway of number 58 and touch the red door. "Bet you can't do it and count to 10, shouted one boy. "I dare you to knock," another girl giggled nervously. But none of them knocked, because sometimes they swore when you got close enough, you could hear something on the other side. Breathing. One child, 8-year-old Tommy from number 62, swore he heard scratching, like fingernails against wood. He ran home crying and refused to walk down the street alone for weeks after. The adults tried to maintain their veneer of suburban politeness. At the March Homeowners Association meeting, the topic of number 58 inevitably came up. "We should do something," Susan Daly urged, her eyes wide as she addressed the group in Mr. Henderson's living room. "We all hear the noises. We all see the boy's bruises. Are we really going to pretend it's not happening?" "We don't know what's happening," countered Mr. Carter, adjusting his tie nervously. "It's not our business unless someone's in real danger." "And how exactly do we know they're not in danger?" Susan snapped. The room went quiet. Nobody had an answer. Finally, Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "Maybe we should just mind our own business. Until we have proof." Proof. The word hung heavy in the air. Proof was something nobody wanted to go looking for. But the whispers continued. In April, when the boy didn't show up to school for a full week, rumors swirled like wildfire. "He's sick. He ran away. His father's keeping him locked inside." When he finally reappeared, his hoodie pulled tighter around his face than ever, he didn't look sick. He looked thinner, paler. His eyes darted constantly, like a rabbit ready to bolt. The bruise on his cheek had faded, but there was a new one on his wrist, just above where his sleeve ended. His teachers noticed but said nothing. His classmates stared but didn't speak. And the neighbors whispered louder than ever. By early May, Willowbrook Lane had become divided. On one side were those like Susan Daly, who couldn't sleep at night knowing something was wrong behind the red door. She started keeping a notebook, writing down every strange noise she heard, every odd thing she saw. She filled pages with times, dates, and descriptions. March 22 to 2:10 a.m., saw father digging again in backyard. Buried something wrapped in tarp. April 4 to 11:30 p.m., heard 3 loud bangs, like someone pounding on a wall. Followed by muffled cry. April 17 to 6:45 p.m., boy looked at me, mouthed, "Help." Her husband rolled his eyes when he found the notebook, but Susan was convinced. If anything happened, she would have proof. On the other side were neighbors like the Carters, who insisted it was all paranoia. "We don't know them, that's all," Mr. Carter said one evening. "They're private people. Privacy isn't a crime." His wife frowned. "But what if it's not just privacy? Then it's for the police to deal with," he snapped, ending the conversation. But the police weren't dealing with it, because nobody was calling them. The tension reached a breaking point in June. It was a humid night, and most of Willowbrook Lane had their windows open to catch the breeze. Around midnight, a sound split the silence. A scream. High-pitched. Terrified. It came from number 58. Lights flicked on in houses up and down the street. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, frozen. The scream came again, followed by a loud crash, like furniture being overturned. Then silence. Phones were picked up, hands hovered over the keypad. But nobody dialed 911. Because what if it wasn't what they thought? What if it was just a fight or a movie or nothing at all? So instead, they whispered. The next morning, the father was seen mowing the lawn as though nothing had happened. His expression was as hard and cold as ever. The mother wasn't seen at all. And the boy, he stood at the upstairs window for a long time, staring out at the street. His eyes met Susan Daly's, and for a moment, she thought he was going to wave. Instead, he lifted his hand, placed it flat against the glass, and stayed that way until the curtain fell shut. The whispers turned into something else that day. Not just suspicion, but fear. By July, number 58 had become the unspoken center of every conversation on Willowbrook Lane. At barbecues, at backyard gatherings, at church services, the topic always circled back to the same place. Do you think they're dangerous? What if the boy disappears for good? What if something already happened? Yet for all their talk, nobody acted. The red door remained closed, its secrets locked inside. The neighbors kept their distance, their curiosity battling with their fear. But Susan Daly's notebook kept filling. And late one night, as she sat by her window with the pages spread before her, she wrote down something that made her hand shake. July 18 to 3:02 a.m., heard digging again. This time, two voices. The boy and the father, both in backyard. Sounded like crying. Sounded like pleading. She put her pen down and stared at the red door. For the first time, she wondered if the whispers weren't just gossip anymore. Maybe they were warnings. And maybe, just maybe, the house at the end of the street wasn't going to keep its secrets buried much longer. By late summer, the boy in number 58 had become more than just a neighbor. He was an obsession. Every household on Willowbrook Lane had noticed him by now, the pale teenager with the sunken eyes and the hood pulled tight over his face. They saw him on his slow walks to school, always alone, his backpack slung low on his shoulders as though it weighed far more than it should. They saw him standing on the porch at dusk, key in hand, hesitating before unlocking the red door. And they saw him most often at the upstairs window, staring out at the street as if longing to be somewhere else. The boy at the window was a silent presence. A reminder. A question nobody wanted to answer. Susan Daly had taken to keeping a pair of binoculars by her kitchen window. She told herself it wasn't spying, not really, it was observation. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was the only one truly paying attention. On the night of August 3rd, she saw him again. He was at the window, his pale face half hidden by the curtain. Susan adjusted the focus and froze. There was no hood this time, no shadow to conceal him. The boy's cheekbone was swollen, his lips split. His eyes, hollow, tired, met hers through the glass. For the briefest second, Susan thought she saw him mouth the same word she'd seen once before, help. Her stomach turned cold. She ran to get her husband. Ron, you have to see this. He's hurt. I think he's... But when Ron reluctantly joined her at the window, the boy was gone. The curtain hung limp. The room behind it was dark. Ron sighed, rubbing his eyes. Susan, you've got to stop. You're working yourself up over nothing. Nothing? Her voice cracked. That boy is begging for help, and we're all pretending we don't see it. Ron shook his head. We don't know what we see. And until we do, it's not our problem. Susan didn't answer. But when Ron went back upstairs to bed, she stayed at the kitchen table with her notebook open, pen in hand. She wrote, August 3 to 11:47 p.m., boy at window again. Bruised. Mouse, help. Other neighbors noticed too, though most didn't admit it out loud. Across the street, Emily Carter, just 10 years old, had taken to leaving little drawings in her bedroom window, facing number 58. Sometimes she drew flowers. Sometimes she drew smiley faces. One day, she drew a stick figure waving, and when she came home from school, she swore the boy had drawn something on his own window in return, a single word scrawled in the condensation. But when she told her mother, Mrs. Carter dismissed it as imagination. You probably just saw streaks on the glass, honey. But Emily insisted. It was a word. I know it. As August wore on, the boy's appearances at the window grew more frequent. Sometimes, he stood motionless for minutes at a time, his hand pressed flat against the glass. Other times, he darted away as if pulled back by someone out of sight. The neighbors began to build their own stories. Maybe he's not allowed outside. Maybe he's being punished. Maybe they're keeping him locked up like a prisoner. But stories were easier than action. Stories could be dismissed. Action meant responsibility. One night, a storm rolled through Willowbrook Lane. Rain pounded against the roofs, thunder shook the windows, and lightning split the sky. Around midnight, Susan sat awake again, her notebook open, when she saw him. The boy was at the window, but this time, something was different. He wasn't just staring. He was holding something, a piece of paper pressed against the glass. Susan squinted, straining to make out the letters through the rain. She grabbed her binoculars and focused. Her heart stopped. The paper read, "Please." Then, as if on cue, a shadow moved behind him. A large figure, broad-shouldered, unmistakable. The father. The boy dropped the paper and stumbled backward. The curtain snapped shut. Susan's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the binoculars. She picked up her phone, thumb hovering over 911. But she didn't dial. Because in the back of her mind, she could hear Ron's voice. What if you're wrong? What if it's nothing? Her hand fell back to her lap. She hated herself for it. The next day, the boy was gone. For 3 days, the window stayed empty. Curtains drawn, lights off. No boy. No sign of life at all. The neighbors whispered louder than ever. Maybe he ran away. Maybe he's gone. I heard the father took him somewhere. Out in the woods. Even the children grew quieter. They no longer dared each other to touch the red door. They no longer laughed when they ran past number 58. The house had shifted from a curiosity to something else. The threat. And then, on the 4th night, the boy returned. He stood at the window, pale as ever, his eyes sunken deeper, his face thinner. But this time, he wasn't alone. A hand gripped his shoulder tightly. Too tightly. The father's hand. The boy didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared out at the street, eyes wide with silent pleading. And then the curtain fell shut again. By September, even those who had once dismissed the whispers began to feel uneasy. At the Homeowners Association meeting, the topic of number 58 dominated the room. "This is getting out of hand," Mr. Carter said, his voice strained. "We're all feeding into paranoia." "Paranoia?" Susan snapped. "You saw it too. We all saw it. That boy is asking for help, and none of us are doing anything." A silence spread through the room. Nobody wanted to admit they had seen it. Nobody wanted to say it out loud. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke softly. "What if we're right? What if something terrible is happening in that house? And what if we're wrong?" Mr. Carter countered. "What if we ruin innocent lives because of rumors?" The room buzzed with nervous energy, but no decision was made. As always, it ended with the same conclusion: do nothing. But Susan couldn't do nothing anymore. One night in mid-September, she sat by her window again, her notebook open, when she saw movement. The boy was back at the window. His lips moved. She grabbed her binoculars, desperate to catch the word. It was just one. Just 3 letters. Her breath caught in her throat. Run from what? Run where? Was he telling her to run, or was he begging for her help to escape? She didn't know. But one thing was clear: the boy at the window wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was a warning. And the house with the red door was holding secrets darker than anyone on Willowbrook Lane dared to imagine. The whispers had grown into something else now. No longer speculation. No longer gossip. They were fear, spreading like a sickness through the cul-de-sac. The boy at the window had become the ghost of Willowbrook Lane. Silent, desperate, and impossible to ignore. And soon, the neighbors would realize that watching wasn't enough. Because whatever was happening behind that red door was reaching a breaking point. And when it broke, none of them would be able to look away. For weeks, the boy had been the focus of every glance, every whisper, every hurried conversation on Willowbrook Lane. But as September deepened, the attention shifted. The boy at the window was no longer the only haunting figure in number 58. The father had stepped into view. The first time Susan Daly truly saw him was on a Saturday morning. She had been trimming the hedge when the red door creaked open. The man who emerged was taller than she expected, well over 6 feet, with a frame that suggested both strength and neglect. His shoulders were broad, but he carried himself with a strange slouch, as though the weight of his own body was too much to bear. He wore an old work jacket, faded at the seams, and jeans stiff with dirt. His beard was patchy, his hair graying at the temples. What unsettled Susan most wasn't his appearance, but his eyes. Dark, glassy, expressionless. He didn't acknowledge her or anyone else. He walked straight to his truck, loaded a crate into the back, and drove off without a sound. But before he left, he looked up. Just once. And Susan could have sworn his gaze landed directly on her. Later that same day, others noticed him too. Mrs. Henderson saw him unloading lumber into the garage. He carried each piece with a strange care, as though the wood were more fragile than it really was. She also noticed something else. The garage door always closed immediately behind him, cutting off any view inside. Mr. Carter saw him in the early hours of the morning, dragging a heavy bag across the lawn into the backyard. The bag sagged and shifted as though it held something alive, or recently alive. When the Carters asked him later about the noise that woke them, he gave no reply. Just that same empty look. Even the children noticed. Emily Carter told her friends at school that the father had eyes like a dead fish, and that he never smiled, not even when her brother shouted hello across the street. The father didn't attend neighborhood meetings. He didn't wave, didn't nod, didn't even appear to hear when someone called out to him. It was as though he existed behind an invisible wall, moving through the world without ever touching it. Yet his presence grew heavier with each passing day. Every time the red door opened, conversation on the street stopped. Parents pulled their children closer. Curtains twitched. Everyone watched. But the father never watched back. Not exactly. His eyes slid past people, grazing them without recognition, without warmth. And that, somehow, was worse. Susan began to keep notes on him as well. September 12 to 6:15 a.m., leaves house carrying a large black bag. Returns 45 minutes later with empty hands. September 15 to 2 p.m., in driveway repairing something. Boy nowhere in sight. September 18th, midnight, truck leaves. Doesn't return until 3:30 a.m. She wrote it all down, convinced that one day it would matter. But the more she watched, the more uneasy she became. Because if the boy at the window had seemed like a plea for help, the father seemed like the answer to a question nobody wanted to ask. It wasn't long before someone tried to confront him. It was early October when David Green, a retired police officer who lived at the corner, finally decided he'd had enough. He marched across the street one afternoon while the father was hauling crates from his truck. "Morning," David called, his voice firm. "I wanted to introduce myself. David Green. I live just down the lane." The father didn't answer. He didn't even look up. He carried another crate into the garage. David frowned. "I've noticed your boy around. Doesn't seem to be outside much. Everything all right at home?" This time, the father stopped. He stood still, back turned, one hand gripping the crate. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, he turned halfway, his face still shadowed. His voice was low, gravelly, and measured. "Mind your own house." Then he disappeared inside, the garage door slamming shut like the final word. David never tried again. That encounter spread quickly among the neighbors. If there had been any thought of intervening before, it vanished after that. The father had drawn a line, and everyone was too afraid to cross it. But the boy at the window didn't stop appearing. If anything, his signals grew more desperate. Sometimes, Susan thought she saw bruises on his arms, faint but unmistakable. Other times, his lips moved in silent words, messages she could almost, but not quite, understand. Each time, her fear of the father deepened. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late October, close to midnight, when a scream tore through Willowbrook Lane. Susan sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering. She knew instantly where it came from. Number 58. She rushed to her window. The house was dark except for the faint glow in the upstairs room. The the boy's window. She could just make out a figure there, thrashing violently as though being pulled backward. Then another figure appeared behind him. Larger. Stronger. The father. The boy's mouth opened wide, but no sound reached her now. Only the image, his face twisted in terror, his hands clawing at the glass. And then he was gone, yanked from view. The curtain fell shut. Susan's scream joined his, though hers carried out into the night. The neighbors spilled onto their porches, some clutching phones, others clutching robes tighter against their bodies. Did you hear that? It came from the boy's house. My God, did you see? But the father never came outside. The house remained still as though nothing had happened at all. Within 20 minutes, the street was quiet again. Nobody called the police. Nobody dared. The next morning, the boy was at the window again. But something had changed. He didn't move. He didn't signal. He just stood there, staring blankly out at the world. And Susan realized with horror that he looked exactly like his father now, hollow, empty, unreachable. The stories about the father grew darker after that night. Some whispered that he wasn't really the boy's father at all, that he had taken the boy from somewhere else. Others claimed they'd seen him digging in the backyard late at night, burying things too large to be tools. Emily Carter swore she saw him standing in the street at 3 a.m., just staring at the houses one by one as though memorizing them. Even David Green admitted quietly that he regretted speaking to him that day. There's something off, he said to Susan. Not just mean. Not just cruel. Something hollow. Like he's missing whatever makes the rest of us human. By November, Willowbrook Lane had changed. Children no longer played outside. Families closed their curtains earlier. Conversations died when the father's truck rumbled down the lane. Number 58 had become the center of everything. The boy at the window was still the symbol, but the father was the fear. And that fear was spreading, because everyone on Willowbrook Lane had begun to realize something dreadful. If the boy was a warning, then the father was a promise. A promise that whatever was happening inside that house was going to spill out. And when it did, it wouldn't just be the family at the end of the street who suffered. It would be all of them. It was November when the whispers began to circle around the door itself. The red door of number 58 had always been there, of course. Since the house was built in the 1920s, that door had faced the street, a bold slash of color against weathered brick. But in the years since the strange family had moved in, the door had taken on a different quality. It wasn't just red anymore, it was too red. The kind of red that didn't fade under sunlight, didn't chip under rain, didn't dull under the weight of time. It gleamed like fresh paint every morning, as though someone painted it over and over again during the night. Susan Daly was the first to mention it aloud. She was having coffee with Margaret Henderson one cold Thursday morning, steam rising from their mugs as they stood in Susan's kitchen window overlooking the lane. "Have you noticed it?" Susan asked quietly. Margaret raised her eyebrows. "Noticed what?" "The door. Always shining. Even after the storms last week. It looks wet, like it's still drying. Doesn't that strike you as strange?" Margaret's lips tightened. She glanced out the window, then back at Susan. Everything about that house is strange. It was small at first, but once Susan said it, others saw it too. The Carters whispered about it when walking their dog. David Green mentioned it when he stopped by for tea. Even the children, who had mostly stopped playing outside, would sometimes mutter about the bloody door of the boy's house. Some said it wasn't paint at all, that maybe it was something else that kept it shining like that. And those who dared say more suggested it might be the same thing that was happening inside that house. The first time Susan got close to it, she swore she could hear something. She had been walking past one morning, clutching her grocery bag, when her eyes drifted to the door. The brass handle gleamed, reflecting her distorted face, and she slowed down without meaning to. The door seemed to hum. Not a real sound, but more like the faint vibration of a low note, something you felt in your bones instead of your ears. She held her breath and leaned closer, and that was when she realized she could almost hear voices. Whispers. Faint, breathless whispers. Her heart seized, and she stumbled backward, nearly dropping her bag. She hurried away, trying to convince herself it was imagination. Just her mind feeding on the neighborhood's paranoia. But she didn't believe that. Not really. By the second week of November, the boy hadn't been seen for days. His window stayed dark, his pale face absent. The neighbors worried, but none dared approach. The father still came and went, hauling crates, dragging bags, moving like a shadow of himself. And the door was always red. Always wet-looking. Always humming. That was when David Green finally said what everyone else was too afraid to say. We need to look inside that house. It was a Saturday night when he gathered the small group in his living room. Susan, Margaret Henderson, and Frank Carter. They spoke in low tones, afraid the walls themselves might carry sound across the street. "Something's happening in there," David said, his voice grave. "I know what you're all thinking, that it's none of our business, that the police should handle it. But I was police. And I'm telling you, I've seen men like that father before. The type who keeps secrets behind locked doors. And when there's a child involved, we don't have the luxury of waiting." Susan's hands trembled around her teacup. "What are you suggesting?" David looked at them each in turn. "We watch for an opportunity. When the father leaves, we go. Just long enough to see. If we find nothing, fine, we leave. But if we find something, then we'll know. And we'll finally have something to take to the authorities." Margaret shook her head furiously. "Break into someone's home? That's madness." Frank Carter leaned forward. "Is it? My wife won't even let our daughter play in the yard anymore. We've all seen things, heard things. You've seen that boy. Do you really think he's all right?" Silence fell. They didn't want to answer. But they didn't need to. Because the boy's screams still rang in their memories. The chance came sooner than expected. 3 nights later, the rumble of the father's truck faded down Willowbrook Lane just after 11 p.m. David Green was waiting. Within minutes, Susan and Frank joined him at the curb outside number 58. Margaret refused to come, though she admitted she'd be watching from her window, praying they made it back out alive. The house loomed before them, darker than the others on the street, its single upstairs window like a dead eye. And there it was, the red door, gleaming even in the weak light of the street lamp. David motioned for them to follow. Standing close, Susan could see what she hadn't dared notice before. The paint wasn't just red, it was layered. Thick, uneven, as though coat after coat had been applied without sanding the old away. She reached out, almost without thinking, and touched it. It was warm. She snatched her hand back, shuddering. David tried the handle. But of course, he slipped a set of tools from his coat pocket. "Give me a moment," he muttered. The air around them felt heavy, pressing against their lungs as he worked. The faint hum Susan had heard before seemed louder now, pulsing through the night. Then, with a soft click, the door swung open. And a rush of air spilled out, cold, stale, and carrying with it the unmistakable scent of iron. Inside, the house was dark. Too dark. Even the weak beam of David's flashlight seemed swallowed whole by the shadows. The floor creaked under their feet as they stepped into the hallway. Old wallpaper peeled in strips, stained with something darker than water. "Stay close," David whispered. They moved through the narrow hall, past a staircase that climbed into blackness. Every corner seemed to watch them. Every door seemed to breathe. Susan's heart pounded as they passed a closed door on the left. A faint scratching came from behind it, soft, deliberate, like fingernails against wood. She froze. "Did you hear that?" But before David could answer, Frank hissed, "The kitchen." The kitchen was worse than any of them expected. The smell hit first, rot, sweet and foul. The sink overflowed with dirty dishes crusted with unidentifiable scraps. The counters were littered with stained rags and rusted tools. And in the corner, a large freezer hummed. David approached it slowly. His hand hovered over the lid. "No," Susan whispered. "Don't." But he pulled it open. Inside, wrapped in thick plastic, were slabs of raw meat. At least, that's what it looked like at first. Until Susan saw the shape of a hand pressed against the plastic. Well, fragile. Her scream tore through the silence before she could stop it. They bolted from the kitchen, stumbling back into the hallway. "We have to go," Frank gasped. "We have to call the police." David's face was pale, but his jaw was set. "We need more than this. If we call them now, he'll deny everything. By the time they get a warrant, it'll all be gone. He turned toward the staircase. No, Susan said, her voice breaking. Please, David. But he was already climbing. The upstairs landing was worse. The wallpaper here was stripped entirely, leaving bare walls streaked with black stains. Doors lined the hallway, all shut tight. David chose the first. He pushed it open. The room was empty except for a mattress on the floor. The sheets were dark with old stains. The smell was unbearable. The next door revealed a closet crammed with crates and jars. Some were filled with cloudy liquid. Others held things Susan couldn't bring herself to name. By the third door, Susan couldn't breathe. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. But the fourth door was different. It was locked. And unlike the others, its handle was worn smooth as though touched countless times. The boy, Susan whispered. David worked quickly, his hands shaking. The lock clicked. He pushed the door open. The room was small, with one window. The window. And there he was. The boy. He stood in the middle of the room, pale and thin, eyes wide as though he hadn't seen light in years. Sweetheart, Susan whispered, stepping forward. It's okay. We're here to help you. But the boy didn't move. His lips trembled, and his eyes darted past them, to the open door. And then Susan realized he wasn't afraid of them. He was afraid of what was behind them. A sound rose from downstairs. The front door slamming shut. The father was home. The sound of the front door slamming was like a gunshot in the silence. Susan's breath caught in her throat, her whole body going rigid as the echo rolled through the house. Frank froze behind her, his eyes wide with panic. David's hand instinctively went to his hip, where no service weapon rested anymore, only the memory of one. The boy in the middle of the room didn't speak, didn't cry out. He just stared at them, wide-eyed, trembling, his lips moving silently as if repeating some mantra only he could hear. Downstairs, heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. Slow, deliberate, a predator's pace. The father was home. Stay quiet, David whispered, his voice low but firm. His training was surfacing, calm, clipped, the way he used to sound when walking into a volatile situation. Susan's legs felt like water beneath her, but she managed a nod. Frank's chest rose and fell too fast, his panic threatening to give them all away. The boy's gaze flicked to the open window. His lips parted just slightly, and for the first time, he spoke. Run. It was barely a whisper, but Susan heard it as clear as thunder. The footsteps reached the base of the stairs. The pause. Then, one creak at a time, the man began to climb. David closed the bedroom door quietly, turning the lock with steady hands. The boy whimpered and flinched at the sound. He knows, the child whispered. His voice was raspy, broken, as though it had forgotten how to speak. He always knows. Susan crouched before him, trying to steady her shaking hands. We'll get you out. I promise. Just stay with us. But the boy only shook his head, his hollow eyes glistening. You shouldn't have come here. The footsteps drew closer, heavier with each step. David moved to the window and yanked it open. The frame groaned, but the glass stayed intact. Cold night air rushed in. Frank, get the boy. Susan, you next. Susan's stomach dropped when she looked outside. The window overlooked the backyard, a steep drop to the ground below. Bushes and overgrown weeds clustered beneath. It was maybe 12 feet. Doable but dangerous. The sound of the father's boots hit the landing. Just outside. Go, David hissed. Frank hesitated for only a moment, then grabbed the boy's thin wrist. Come on, kid. But the boy resisted. He dug his heels into the floor, eyes wide with terror. He'll hear me. David swore under his breath. The handle of the door rattled. Go. Susan moved first. She hoisted herself onto the sill, heart hammering. For one dizzying moment she stared down into darkness. Then she shut her eyes and jumped. The bushes broke her fall, tearing her arms, but she landed hard, the breath whooshing out of her chest. Above her, the door shook violently. The father was at the other side now. David yanked Frank forward. Take the kid. Now. Frank wrapped his arms around the boy, practically hauling him to the window. The child screamed, a small, raw sound that cut through the night. It was the first sound of resistance he'd made, and it chilled David's blood. The father roared. The door splintered. Frank shoved the boy out of the window and followed, crashing into the bushes beside Susan. The child cried out in pain, his voice high and broken. David turned back to the door. It exploded inward. The father filled the doorway like a shadow cut from the dark itself. He was taller than David remembered, broad-shouldered, his face pale and wild, eyes glowing with something that wasn't entirely human. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then the man smiled. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, echoing his son's words. His voice was low, guttural, the kind of voice that crawled beneath the skin. David stepped backward toward the window, but he didn't look away. "It's over. People know. The police will be here any minute." The father's grin widened. "You think they'll find anything? You think they'll believe you?" David moved fast. He threw himself out the window just as the father lunged forward. His shoulder caught the frame, sending a crack of pain through his body, but he tumbled into the weeds below. He scrambled to his feet. "Run!" The four of them bolted through the backyard, weeds snapping beneath their feet. Susan's lungs burned, but she didn't stop, clutching the boy's hand as they tore toward the tree line. Behind them, the father's roar shook the night. A door slammed open. Heavy footsteps thundered across the yard. Frank stumbled, dragging the boy. David grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Keep moving." They reached the edge of the trees. Branches clawed at their skin, but the darkness swallowed them, giving them cover. They ran until their legs felt like breaking, until Susan thought her heart might burst. Finally, they collapsed in a clearing. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing. The boy sat motionless, staring at nothing, his small hands trembling. Susan pulled him into her arms. "It's okay," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't. "You're safe now." But in the pit of her stomach, she knew the father wasn't far behind. David pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed. "We need units." Willowbrook Lane, number 58. Possible child endangerment, homicide evidence on site. Suspect still in the area. Send everyone. His voice cracked on the last word. He hadn't sounded like a cop in years, but in that moment, it all came flooding back. Frank knelt beside the boy. "We've got you now, kid. What's your name?" The boy's lips trembled. At first, no sound came. Then, barely audible, "Ethan." Susan tightened her grip. "Ethan, you're going to be okay." But Ethan shook his head slowly. "He always finds me." The sound of snapping branches made them all freeze. David's flashlight flickered across the tree line. Shadows shifted. A shape moved between the trunks, too tall, too fast. "Run!" David barked again. They stumbled back onto a narrow path, the boy clinging to Susan's side. Every step felt like a lifetime. The woods seemed endless. And then, headlights. Flashing red and blue. Police cruisers roared up the dirt road, tires spitting gravel. Officers spilled out, guns drawn. David raised his hands, waving. "Here. Over here." An officer rushed forward, helping Susan with the boy. Another grabbed Frank. But David's eyes stayed on the tree-line. Because the father wasn't there anymore. The house was searched within the hour. Dozens of officers combed through number 58, opening every room, tearing up floorboards, pulling apart the basement. What they found chilled the entire department. The freezer, the stained mattress, the crates filled with jars, and bones. So many bones. But the father was gone. No trace of him remained. No footprints in the dirt, no trail through the woods. It was as though he had simply vanished into the night. By dawn, news vans had arrived. The quiet neighborhood was swarmed with flashing lights and curious eyes. Neighbors whispered behind fences, clutching their children close. Susan sat on the back of an ambulance, Ethan wrapped in a blanket beside her. His eyes were still wide, still hollow. He hadn't spoken another word. David stood a few feet away, watching as the coroner's van pulled up. His face was pale, haunted. Frank approached, his arm bandaged where he'd been cut. We did the right thing, he said quietly. Didn't we? David didn't answer. His eyes lingered on the house, on the red door that gleamed in the morning light, wet and shining as though freshly painted. And he swore, just for a moment, that he could hear it humming. The morning sun was pale and sluggish, barely strong enough to push through the low, gray clouds that hung over the cul-de-sac like a heavy shroud. Detective Claire Donnelly sat in her unmarked sedan across from the house with the red door, her eyes fixed on the dark windows that seemed to stare back at her with equal intensity. Inside, she knew, the family carried on with their routine, or at least their imitation of one, while beneath it all lay a thrum of secrets no one was eager to share. The mother, Evelyn Kramer, had so far been the quietest of them all. She had spoken at length only once, in the immediate aftermath of her son Michael's disappearance. Her words had been clipped, her face tight, as though every syllable were a brick laid carefully in a wall she didn't want anyone breaching. Since then, she had retreated further and further into herself. While her husband Richard had raged, cried, and offered piecemeal recollections of their life, Evelyn had become a shadow, haunting the edges of her own home. Claire decided it was time to press harder. She parked, took a deep breath, and crossed the street. The porch boards creaked under her boots as she rang the bell. Evelyn answered. She was thinner than Claire remembered, her cheeks hollowed, her once neat hair falling in strands around her face. Her eyes looked as though they had not known sleep for years. "Detective Donnelly," Evelyn said, her voice flat. "You're back again." "I am," Claire replied softly. "Do you mind if I come in? I'd like to talk to you. Alone." A flicker of hesitation passed across Evelyn's face. Then she stepped aside. Richard's at work. Daniel's at school. That was exactly what Claire had hoped to hear. The living room was dim, curtains drawn tight against the morning light. A faint smell of lavender lingered, masking something sharper underneath, cigarette smoke, though Evelyn had never been known to smoke. Claire's eyes landed on the red door at the end of the hallway. Even from here, it seemed to pulse faintly, as though it contained some terrible secret trying to claw its way out. They sat across from each other, Evelyn perched stiffly in an armchair, Claire on the edge of the couch. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "Evelyn," she said gently, "I've talked to everyone else in this family. I've heard Richard's side, I've spoken with Daniel. But I haven't really heard from you. Not since the beginning." Evelyn's gaze slid toward the window. "What is there to say? My son is gone. He's been gone for years. Talking about it won't bring him back." "Talking about it might bring us closer to the truth," Claire countered. "The night Michael disappeared, you said you put him to bed. That was the last time you saw him." "That's right." "Evelyn, is that really the last time?" Her lips pressed together, pale and bloodless. Claire studied her, noticing the way Evelyn's hands trembled slightly in her lap. This was not the blank resignation of a grieving mother. This was something else. "You've carried a lot of silence," Claire continued softly. "Too much. And silence, it can weigh more than grief itself." For the first time, Evelyn's eyes flicked toward her with something sharp, almost defensive. "You think I don't know grief?" "I think you know it better than most," Claire said carefully. "But I also think there's something else you know. Something you haven't been able to say." The clock ticked in the corner. Evelyn's breathing hitched, shallow, uneven. Finally, she whispered, "Richard doesn't know." Claire leaned forward. "Doesn't know what?" "That night," Evelyn said, her voice cracking. "I woke up around 2. I went to check on Michael. Her hands twisted together, fingers nodding. The door to his room was open. He wasn't there. At first I thought maybe he had crawled into Daniel's bed. But he wasn't there either. I searched every room. You told us you only discovered he was gone in the morning." Evelyn's eyes glistened. "I lied. I found out hours before dawn. But I didn't call the police until morning." The confession hit Claire like a stone. "But why wait?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "Because I saw something." Claire's pulse quickened. "What did you see?" Evelyn's voice was barely audible now. "The red door was open. Just a crack. I swear it was. And there was light inside. Like fire. and someone was there. A man. His face. She shook her head violently as though trying to erase the memory. It wasn't human. I thought I was dreaming. I thought I was losing my mind. A chill crept over Claire. She wanted to dismiss Evelyn's account as the product of trauma and exhaustion, but she'd heard too many whispers from neighbors about strange lights, sounds, and shadows connected to that cursed door. You were afraid no one would believe you, Claire said. Evelyn nodded, her lips trembling. Richard would have thought I'd gone mad. The police would have written me off. So I waited. I told myself maybe he would come back, that maybe it was just sleepwalking. But by morning it was too late. Tears streaked her face, raw and unrestrained. For the first time, Evelyn looked less like a grieving statue and more like a mother shattered by unbearable guilt. Evelyn, Claire said softly, this is important. That door, it keeps coming up. You saw someone there. You're sure? Her answer came in a whisper that seemed to echo through the house. Yes. I think Michael was taken through it. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything Claire had heard yet. Evelyn buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Claire sat still, the red door looming at the edge of her vision, its silence louder than thunder. Whatever secret it held, Evelyn had carried its shadow alone for years. And now, with her silence broken, Claire knew there was no turning back. The path forward led straight through that door, whether it opened to truth or something far darker. The house was silent that night, though not in the comforting way of a home at rest. Silence here was sharp, a blade hanging above the heads of those who dared to remain inside. Claire Donnelly had stayed later than usual, lingering long after her official duties were finished. She told herself it was because she didn't trust Richard to be alone with Evelyn, not after the cracks in their marriage had shown so clearly in their last conversations. But deep down she knew it was because of the door. The red door. It sat at the far end of the hallway like a wound that would not close. Evelyn's confession still gnawed at her. I think Michael was taken through it. The detective had stood in front of it more than once, studying the chipped crimson paint, the brass handle dulled with age. Each time she had reached for it, some invisible force had held her back, the sense that crossing that threshold would alter everything. Tonight, though, she resolved she could wait no longer. Evelyn drifted through the house like a phantom, moving without purpose, her eyes glassy. Richard was still at work. Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch with the television flickering faintly across his face. Claire took her chance. She walked slowly down the hall. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. Her heart hammered in her chest. She stopped before the door, her hand trembling inches from the handle. This is just a room, she told herself. Just a locked, dusty room. She turned the handle. It gave without resistance. The door swung inward with a long, groaning sigh, as though it hadn't been opened in decades. Claire held her breath. Inside, she expected darkness. Instead, the faintest glow spilled out, an amber light that pulsed like the dying embers of a fire. Her throat tightened. Evelyn had not been lying. Claire stepped across the threshold. The room was small, maybe 10 feet square, but the air was thick and heavy, like stepping into a cellar where the air had gone stale. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, but on closer inspection she realized it wasn't wallpaper at all. It was drawings, hundreds of them, sketched directly onto the plaster in a child's uneven hand. Her breath caught. The drawings were of a boy. The same boy over and over again. Sometimes smiling. Sometimes crying. Sometimes standing before a tall, faceless man drawn in dark charcoal strokes. Claire moved closer, her fingers brushing one of the crude sketches. Her skin prickled. The floor creaked behind her. She spun around. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her face pale as milk, her eyes wide with terror. You shouldn't be in here, she whispered. Evelyn, Claire said carefully, what is this? Evelyn shook her head violently. I told you, the door shouldn't be opened. But why? Because when it's open, Evelyn's voice cracked. He comes back. As if on cue, the glow in the room flickered. The faint warmth of it shifted, becoming harsher, hotter. Claire's instincts screamed at her to step back, but she held her ground. Who comes back? Claire demanded. Evelyn's lips parted. But before she could answer, the sound came. A low, rasping breath. It came from the farthest corner of the room, where the light seemed to concentrate. Claire turned slowly, her hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at her hip. But what she saw made her freeze. A figure was forming out of the glow, like smoke gathering into shape. Its features melted and shifting, like a face caught in flames. For an instant she thought she saw eyes, hollow and burning. Evelyn stumbled backward. "Don't look at him," she hissed. But Claire couldn't look away. The figure stretched taller, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its presence was suffocating, filling every inch of the small room. And then, beneath the rasp of its breath, came another sound. A child's voice. Faint. Distant. "Mom." Evelyn's sob broke the air like glass. She collapsed against the door frame, her body racked with tremors. Claire's skin turned to ice. "Michael!" Claire whispered. The boy's voice came again, warped and muffled, as though carried from somewhere impossibly far away. "Help me!" Claire's hands shook violently now. "Evelyn, do you hear that?" "Yes," Evelyn choked. "I've heard it for years." The figure began to move, its form swaying, flickering like a flame caught in a wind. And as it moved, the drawings on the walls seemed to writhe. The child's faces twisted, their smiles stretching, their eyes hollowing. The faceless man grew darker, his outline etched deeper into the plaster as though the house itself wanted him remembered. "Evelyn, we need to close the door," Claire said firmly. But Evelyn shook her head. "It doesn't matter. Once it's open, it doesn't close." The glow flared, so bright Claire had to shield her eyes. The sound of the boy's voice grew louder, pleading now. "Mom, please." Evelyn dropped to her knees, her sobs tearing through the room. "I'm sorry, Michael. I'm sorry I didn't help you that night." The figure loomed closer, its hollow eyes fixed on Claire now. Her chest tightened. It was no longer just a shadow. It was solidifying, burning into reality. And then, as suddenly as it began, the glow snapped out. The room fell into darkness. Only the red door remained, its edges glowing faintly in the pitch black, as if the wood itself was aflame from the inside. Claire stumbled backward, dragging Evelyn out with her. She slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating like a gunshot through the house. They stood in the hall, gasping for air. Daniel stirred on the couch but didn't wake. Evelyn's face was streaked with tears, her hands clutching her chest as though her heart might give out. Claire's pulse hammered in her ears. "Evelyn, what is this?" Evelyn looked at her with hollow eyes, her voice a broken whisper. "It's not a door to a room, detective. It's a door to him. And once he's called, he doesn't leave." The red door stayed shut, but its presence lingered like an open wound. Even when locked, it seemed to breathe, a subtle thrum in the walls, a pulse that carried down the hallway like a heartbeat too close to the ear. Claire had slept little, her mind a whirlpool of questions. She knew what she had seen, a figure, almost human but not. And she had heard the voice of a child. Michael. By morning, Evelyn was unreachable. She hadn't left her bedroom, and when Claire knocked softly on the door, the only response was the muffled sound of a woman crying into a pillow. Daniel avoided the subject entirely. He left for school without a word, his backpack slung low on his shoulders, his face pale. Claire made note of every detail, the silence, the fear, the denial. The family was unraveling in real time, each thread tugged loose by that crimson door. Claire drove into town, hoping that some distance might give her clarity. But the neighborhood itself seemed to cling to her like a shadow. At the local diner, she sat at the counter with a bitter cup of coffee. A few townsfolk cast wary glances in her direction, whispering into their cups. She was the outsider, the one stirring the dust off secrets people had learned to live with. An elderly man 2 stools down cleared his throat. His voice was gravelly, heavy with years. "You staying at the Donnelly house?" Claire turned. "I've been working there, yes." "Why?" The man's face darkened. "That door shouldn't be opened." Claire stiffened. "You know about it?" The man gave a slow nod. "Everyone in town knows. Most just don't talk about it. Folks disappear when they talk too much." He He pushed his coffee aside, his hand trembling. "When I was a boy, my uncle did some repair work on that house. He came back white as a sheet. Said he saw a man standing in the doorway, even though the room was empty. Staring. Just staring. My uncle never set foot in there again." Claire's pulse quickened. Did he say who the man was? No name. Just a shape. A man in the doorway. Always watching. The words lodged in her chest like a stone. She thanked him quietly, finished her coffee, and drove back to the house. The afternoon sun was slipping low when she returned. The house looked almost peaceful in the golden light, but Claire knew better. She found Evelyn sitting in the living room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Evelyn," Claire said gently, "I need you to tell me about the man in the doorway." Evelyn's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "You saw him?" "Yes," Claire admitted. "But I need to know who he is. What he wants." Evelyn's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. "He wants Michael. He always wanted Michael." Claire leaned forward. "Why?" Evelyn's eyes glistened with tears. "Because Michael was his. Not Richard's. Not mine. His." Claire froze. "What do you mean?" But before Evelyn could answer, a sound cut through the air, a slow, deliberate knock. 3 raps against wood. The sound came from the hallway. Both women turned. The red door stood closed, its edges dark, but the sound had been unmistakable. A knock. From the inside. Claire's hand went to her sidearm. She rose slowly, every muscle tense. Evelyn's body shuddered with silent sobs. "Don't open it," Evelyn begged. "Please don't." But Claire had never been one to ignore danger. Step by cautious step, she approached the door. The hallway seemed to stretch longer with each pace, the air colder, heavier. She reached out and pressed her hand flat against the wood. It vibrated faintly beneath her touch, as though something on the other side was breathing against it. "Who's there?" she demanded. Silence. Then, a voice. "You shouldn't be here, detective." Claire's blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone she'd be in this house. Not the department, not the neighbors. Her throat tightened. "Who are you?" The voice chuckled softly. "You already know." Her hand gripped the knob. Against every instinct screaming in her body, she twisted it. The door opened. The room inside was no longer glowing. It was dark, the only light spilling from the hallway behind her. But standing in the center, as solid as any living man, was the figure. His features were obscured, as if a veil of smoke clung to his face. Yet his eyes shone faintly, 2 embers burning in the dark. Claire raised her weapon. "Don't move." The man didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head, studying her like a specimen pinned beneath glass. "You don't belong here," he said again. His voice was calm, measured, but threaded with something ancient, something heavy. "This house isn't yours." Claire steadied her aim. "Where is Michael?" The man's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, though it looked more like a wound. "He's with me. He has always been with me." Evelyn's sobs echoed down the hall. "Please stop. Leave him alone." The man turned his head slightly, his ember eyes settling on Evelyn's trembling figure in the doorway. "You gave him to me," he said softly. "Don't pretend otherwise." Evelyn crumpled, covering her ears, shaking her head. "No, I didn't mean to. I didn't." Claire's finger tightened on the trigger. "Let the boy go." The man's laugh was low, hollow. "You still don't understand, detective. He isn't a boy anymore. He belongs here. Just as you soon will." And with that, he stepped forward. The room seemed to stretch as he moved, shadows pouring from his figure like ink spilling across paper. The temperature plummeted. Claire fired once, twice, the shots cracking through the house like thunder. The man didn't fall. The bullets passed through him, the smoke of his body rippling like disturbed water. His ember eyes burned brighter, locking onto her. Then, without another word, he stopped at the threshold of the red door. His form filled it completely, a towering presence blocking the way. He stood there, silent, watching her. The man in the doorway. Evelyn's wail filled the house. Daniel, awakened by the gunshots, stumbled into the hall, his face white with terror. "Mom? What's happening?" But Claire didn't look away. She held her ground, staring into those burning eyes, her breath ragged. The man leaned forward slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You've opened the door. Now it won't close." And then, like smoke scattered by a sudden wind, he vanished. The red door swung shut with a deafening slam. Silence fell. But the echo of his words lingered, wrapping itself around Claire's mind like a chain. Now it won't close. The house stood still at dawn, its red door closed, its windows blind. But those who lived near it swore that something inside still moved. For Claire Donnelly, the hours after the encounter with the man in the doorway blurred into a haze of fractured memories. She remembered Daniel clinging to his mother's trembling body, Evelyn whispering prayers into the air like charms against a storm. She remembered the silence after her bullets had failed, and the way the red door had slammed shut by itself, rattling the floorboards as though the house itself had teeth. By morning, she sat on the front steps with a cigarette she never lit, staring out at the quiet street. It looked so ordinary, the cul-de-sac trimmed neatly, neighbors hosing their driveways, children on bicycles ringing bells. But she knew now that the ordinariness was a lie. The house had always been a mask. And masks only hid what people refused to see. The department descended on the Donnelly home within hours. Officers cordoned off the street, forensics trucks lined the curb. Claire, though still rattled, had insisted on an official search. She told them about the drawings, the glow, the boy's voice. She didn't tell them about the man. The team pried open the red door, breaking the hinges when the lock resisted. The room was exactly as Claire remembered, walls scrawled with hundreds of childish sketches. But now the drawings had changed. Where once there had been smiling faces and stick figures of a boy, there was only one image repeated over and over. A tall figure standing in the doorway. The faceless man. The forensics team cataloged the sketches, scraping plaster for samples, dusting for prints. But they found no trace of the boy, no human remains, no explanation. Just the smell of burnt wood that clung to everything. When they finished, they sealed the room with heavy boards. Yet Claire knew boards meant nothing. Evelyn refused to leave. "This is my house," she told Claire, her voice shaking but firm. "I won't run. If Michael is still here, if he's trapped, then I can't abandon him." Daniel begged her otherwise. He wanted to move, to leave town, to escape. But Evelyn only shook her head. Her silence had protected her husband for years. Now it was binding her to the house. Claire stayed with them for 2 nights. She didn't sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, she heard the knocking again. 3 slow raps against wood. Each time she woke, she swore she saw the faint glow spilling out from beneath the boards. On the 3rd night, she rose to find Evelyn sitting in the hallway, staring at the red door. Evelyn's face was gaunt, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "He's not gone," she said softly. Claire didn't ask who she meant. The town changed after the police search. Neighbors stopped walking their dogs past the house. Curtains stayed drawn, children warned to steer clear. Rumors spread like wildfire about screams in the night, about figures in the windows when no one was home, about the smell of smoke that seeped into the air after sunset. The Donnelly house became that house, the one whispered about in grocery stores and schoolyards. The house at the end of the street. But for Claire, it wasn't just another urban legend. It was unfinished business. She filed her reports, though she stripped them of anything supernatural. Officially, Michael Donnelly remained missing. Richard Donnelly was still under suspicion but remained free, his whereabouts uncertain. And as for the red door, it wasn't mentioned at all. Her superiors had raised eyebrows at the lack of progress. But no one pressed too hard. Some cases in small towns had a way of dissolving into silence. Weeks later, Claire returned alone. The boards still held, nailed tight across the frame of the red door. Dust collected in the corners of the house, furniture covered in sheets. Evelyn and Daniel had finally moved, pushed out by whispers and grief. The house was empty. Almost. Claire walked the hallway slowly, her flashlight beams slicing the dark. The air was cold, though it was late summer. She stopped in front of the sealed door. Her pulse thrummed in her ears. And then, faintly, she heard it. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. Her breath caught. She stepped closer, placing her hand against the boards. The vibration pulsed through her skin like a heartbeat. A voice followed, soft, childlike. "Help me!" Claire's vision blurred with sudden tears. "Michael," she whispered. Silence. Then another voice. "You opened the door, detective. You belong here now." Her hand dropped from the wood. She staggered backward, her chest tight. The flashlight flickered, the beam dying for a moment. When it blinked back to life, the boards were unchanged. But for a second, just a second, she saw him. The man in the doorway. His burning eyes stared at her from the cracks in the boards. She fled the house. Months passed. The Donnelly house sat abandoned. The lawn grew wild, weeds twisting through the cracked pavement of the driveway. Windows collected dust, but still, neighbors swore they sometimes saw the curtains shift. The red door, though boarded, became a beacon. Teenagers dared each other to sneak in at night. Some came back pale, swearing they'd heard knocking. Others claimed they'd seen a man standing in the hallway, watching them. The police dismissed the stories. But the town didn't. The house became legend. The house at the end of the street. And though she tried, Claire could not let it go. Sometimes, in her dreams, she saw the boy at the window, his face pressed to the glass, his mouth forming silent words. Sometimes she woke with the smell of smoke in her hair, her lungs aching as though she'd breathed in ash. One night, she drove past the house. The board still held. The street was empty. But as her headlights swept across the facade, she saw it clearly. The red door was open, and in the doorway stood a man. His eyes burning, waiting, watching. The house remains empty to this day. Realtors refuse to list it. Neighbors walk a wide circle around it. The children who once rang bells on their bikes now cross to the other side of the street. But still, the door waits. And if you listen closely, if you're quiet enough, you'll hear it. 3 knocks. From the inside.